Hello and welcome back to Biology for Beginners. As always, I'm your host Morgan, and today we're going to conclude our waltz through the cell and the cell structures by talking about the cytoskeleton, cellular movement, and junctions between cells. As always, we're taking this moment before we officially begin to pop up those terms and definition slides so that you can pause the video and grab the vocabulary that you will be hearing throughout this video. Also, a reminder that if you would like a PDF of all of my slides, that is available for absolutely free over on my Patreon. The link to that is down in the description below. And also this week I am including a chart that just kind of outlines everything we've gone over during this last chapter 4. There's a chart very similar to it available in the textbook I'm using that I chose not to include in my slides. One, for copyright reasons with the textbook, and two, because I found the chart itself to be a little confusing if you are new to these concepts and looking at that. So I am making a little bit more organized version that will be available, filled out, and also empty if you happen to be using this as a study tool, so you have a version of that to fill out on your own as well. Without further ado, let's get into it. First things first, we're going to start off our chat today by talking about the cytoskeleton. Now, the cytoskeleton is a network of little fibers that provide the structural support for cells. So like the skeleton in your body helps keep your shape and hold you up, the cytoskeleton does that for every single cell. And the cytoskeleton is important because it interacts with these things called motor proteins to facilitate the movement of organelles within the cell and also cells through their environment, which is extremely important for like single-celled organisms and other things like that, or cells that aren't necessarily an organism on their own, like sperm in animals that reproduce sexually. They need to be motile to reach the egg cell, but we'll talk about reproduction in later chapters. And these cytoskeletons are made of 3 main types of fibers, which we will get into now. The first and largest type of these fibers that make up the cytoskeleton are the microtubules. These particular kinds of fibers are straight, hollow tubes that are composed of globular proteins called tubulins. Now, globular just kind of represents the overall shape of the protein, and if you don't necessarily know what that means, that's not as important if you're just getting a surface level understanding of biology that one would expect from a non-majors course or intro course. So for our purposes, globular is basically just an adjective here that describes what the protein looks like. And you don't really get into the more technical definition of what that would mean unless you're taking some sort of biochemistry or more specialized course. So microtubules can be easily disassembled, which is what kind of makes them different to the other fibers that we'll talk about in this video. Now, in animal cells specifically, they grow out of something called centrosomes, which kind of holds them together in the middle there. And they act as tracks for certain organelles to move within the cell with the help of other motor proteins that allow those organelles to kind of walk along the microtubules. And then another important function of them is that they also guide the chromosome movement when cells divide. And they're the main component of cilia and flagella, which are things that help cells move. And we will get into that in just a moment. But I did mention that in animal cells, they grow out of centrosomes, but in plant cells, they're organized a little bit differently. That is not talked about in this chapter, so I'm not going to talk about it here. Before we move on to the next two types of fibers that make up the cytoskeleton, we're going to pause here and talk about cilia and flagella. Now, in eukaryotic cells, they are made up of 9 microtubule doublets that surround a central pair of microtubules, so a 9+2 pattern, which is what it is known as. And these little packages of microtubules are covered by extensions of the plasma membrane that encloses the cell. Now, flagella specifically, cells usually only have 1 or maybe 2 of them, and they tend to propel the cell in sort of an undulating whip-like motion. So if you see in this image here, singular, they're called flagellum, which is why the structure in the photo is labeled flagellum, not flagella. But the point here is that very long thing coming off of the sperm cell being shown is the flagellum that basically moves around real fast and helps to propel that cell. Cilia, on the other hand, are quite a bit shorter, and cells that do have cilia usually have many. And if they're used to propel the cell, it's more like an organized team of rowers, and they're used more like oars than a sort of sporadic whip-like undulating motion like the flagella. However, cilia can also have multiple functions, not just technically for movement. They can also be used like the ones in the respiratory system shown in the image, to kind of trap mucus that has debris on it, and other functions like that, and sensory functions, but they'll still move much the same way with the motor proteins that will kind of help. They'll attach to those microtubules and cause the bending in the flagella and the cilia, which then creates the motion needed for whatever the purpose of that particular appendage is for. Now we're going to move on to intermediate filaments, which are kind of the middle ground for the fibers that make up the cytoskeleton. They're made of fibrous proteins, which is just another kind of protein, and they basically help the cell hold its shape. They're also very important in anchoring organelles into place, especially the nucleus, which is often going to be cradled in kind of a basket of intermediate filaments. So they just anchor those organelles that have no reason to be moving around the cell. They're not like a lysosome that needs to move to a food vacuole. It's more important that this organelle stays in one place. And unlike microtubules, they are not readily disassembled. They're kind of more like a very strong cord-like coiled fiber, and kind of have the structure of like a metal cable. They're very strong, they hold things in place and help keep things in the appropriate shape. The smallest and final fiber of the cytoskeleton that we need to talk about today are microfilaments. So they're characterized by basically being these solid rods made of the globular protein actin. And they're kind of arranged in a twisted double chain, which adds to their strength. And then they form a 3D network that also helps to support the cell's shape. These particular filaments are also important in movement because they also interact with the motor protein myosin to facilitate that cellular movement and specifically contractile movements. So they're very important in cells of the muscles. They're important in that kind of contractile crawling motion that amoebas exhibit. And you'll also find a lot of the microfilaments helping with the movement of some white blood cells. But we will get into all that fun stuff in later chapters when we're actually discussing movement and locomotion. So all throughout chapter 4, we've talked a lot about what's inside a cell, but right now we need to switch and look a little bit to the surface and the outside of the cell. And the first thing we're going to talk about here is the extracellular matrix. And what the extracellular matrix is it's basically just a layer of glycoproteins and polysaccharides that are secreted by animal cells, and they kind of help hold the cells in specific tissues together and help protect the plasma membranes of those cells. Specifically, collagen is one of those glycoproteins that's secreted into the extracellular matrix. And the extracellular matrix is able to kind of connect to the cytoplasm through what is known as an integrin. Now, these integrins span the plasma membrane, and they're able to connect the cytoplasm with that extracellular matrix and also allow the transmission of signals and kind of communicate that external and internal changes and help the overall function of the tissue and the cells in the surrounding area. So zooming out a little farther, you're going to see where cells start to kind of sit next to each other. And where you get cells touching, you get these junctions between those cells. So first of all, we're going to talk about the 3 types of junctions in animal cells. The first kind of junction is known as a tight junction, where the cells are knit together by proteins very tightly, and that prevents the movement and leakage of fluids. This type of junction is very important in things like the digestive tract, where one side of that junction is very acidic and the other side is not. So it's very important that fluids cannot leak out of those tissues or into the bodies of the cells that are directly touching the interior of the greater organ. The second type of junction is the anchoring junction. And the anchoring junction, you can kind of guess what it does. It holds the cells together, specifically into like strong sheets, and it's made up of a lot of intermediate filaments that anchor these things together with these junctions in the cytoplasm. So the cytoplasm of one cell is kind of anchored to the cytoplasm of another, and it's very common to find this type of junction in things like the skin and muscle tissue that are under a lot of stress constantly. So they just need a little bit more anchorage to hold the cells of the tissues together. And then the last kind of junction is known as a gap junction. And basically what these do is they allow the flow of small molecules and ions between cells, which allows for the transfer of nutrients and the molecules that signal cells to do one thing or another. Up to this point, I'm sure you've noticed that we focus primarily on animal cells here. And don't worry, right now we're going to move on to those connections in plant cells, because while plant cells still have that cytoskeleton, they still have those fibers that make it up, they also have that rigid cell wall outside of their plasma membrane that provides support. But also when those cells stop growing, that wall strengthens, and it kind of seems like that might hinder certain cellular functions, especially with transmitting signals and things, because the wall is more rigid and not quite as easy to get signals and molecules and other things through. So it may hinder the communication between cells in a plant. Well, let's back up for a second. So the animal cells we talked about are connected through these junctions that kind of hold them together. Well, plant cells are sort of glued together by a polysaccharide known as pectin. So basically it's very sticky, and it'll be secreted and stick the relevant cells together to help provide structure and support to the plant. And to solve that issue of transferring nutrients and molecules and signals and water among the cells, there are these little channels inside the cell walls known as the plasmodesmata that allow for those molecules and ions and water and whatever else needs to be transferred to flow freely between those cells. Now, when you get into different structures in the plant and different plant organ systems, it gets a little more complicated than that, but that is all for another video, since that is full of a lot of terminology and a lot of things that are going to be new to a lot of people, and plants are weird, so I'm not going to make you suffer that today. That will come in the future when you least expect it. But this is all I have for you guys today. Congratulations on getting through chapter 4, and I hope that we're all excited to start chapter 5 in the very near future. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, evening, afternoon, night, what have you. Don't forget to click subscribe, like, comment, and I will see you all in the next one. Thank you again for watching this video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and ring that bell if you would like to see more. And if you'd like to follow me on any of my other social medias, the links are down in the description below. Don't forget to check out thereptilegoth.com for all of my articles and blog posts. If you found any value in this video and you would like to help support the channel, please check out my Patreon page. That link is also in the description down below. And a special thanks goes out to my Diamond Dragon patron, Diane V. What you're doing is really helping me fund a dream here. I will see you guys all in the next one.